December 1944. The forests of Belgium burned with the sound of artillery. Snow fell thick and heavy over bodies that no longer moved, hiding their faces beneath a white shroud. Somewhere between the shattered lines of the Ardennes, a faint cry echoed, not in English, but in German. It was a voice asking for help. American medics, crouched in a frozen ditch, heard it through the smoke. Their orders were clear: save the wounded, no matter who they were. They moved carefully, dragging their stretchers through the snow, crossing into ground still watched by German rifles. Bullets cracked above them, trees splintered, but they kept going, their Red Cross armbands barely visible against the storm. When they reached the German soldier, his uniform soaked dark with blood, he looked up in disbelief. The men who had been shooting at him moments before were now binding his wounds. Around them, war raged without mercy. But in that small circle of snow, mercy had returned. The Germans watching from across the line could not understand what they were seeing. Because in this war of annihilation, compassion was not expected. And yet, it was happening. By the winter of 1944, Europe was bleeding from every direction. The Allied invasion of Normandy had torn open Hitler's Western Front, and the German army, once unstoppable, was retreating through the shattered towns of France and Belgium. Villages that had stood for centuries now lay in ruins. Civilians hid in cellars. Roads were clogged with burnt tanks, broken wagons, and the frozen bodies of men who would never go home. Every field hospital was full. Every medic carried more pain than medicine. Yet even amid this vast machinery of destruction, there remained one constant code. The wounded must be helped. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had set this principle in law, that medics and the wounded were to be spared, that the Red Crow Bromo SS on a sleeve or helmet was a mark of protection. But by 1944, this ideal was often buried beneath the hate and chaos of total war. German snipers sometimes targeted medics deliberately, believing the cross made an easier mark. American troops, hardened by years of brutal fighting, sometimes doubted whether mercy could survive at all. Still, the medics of the U.S. Army trained under a promise that life itself was sacred, no matter the uniform that wore it. Their work began before dawn and ended long after nightfall. In every campaign, from Normandy's beaches to the hedgerows of France, they carried the same burden, crawling under fire to save men screaming for help, often not knowing if those cries were from friend or foe. They learned to move silently, to ignore the fear that each shell might be their last. Their only weapon was courage. Their only duty was life. By December, the front lines were blurring. German and American soldiers were often separated by just a few hundred yards of snow and forest. Wounded men lay between them, caught in the no-man's land of ice and fear. Sometimes both sides called out for medics, and sometimes, against every rule of war, both sides paused their fire long enough for the rescuers to do their work. But it was not always that simple. In the bitter cold of the Ardennes, confusion reigned. Units were cut off, radios failed, and uniforms looked nearly the same beneath the frost. To reach a wounded man was to step into death's shadow. And yet, stories began to spread, quiet ones, passed from camp to camp, about American medics who risked everything to treat German wounded. Some soldiers dismissed them as foolish, others as heroic. But for those who had seen it, it was unforgettable. In one battle near the Siegfried Line, 2 medics carried a wounded German officer on a stretcher for over a mile through artillery fire, refusing to leave him behind. When they reached the aid station, they treated him alongside American casualties, sharing the same morphine, the same blankets, the same human touch. These moments did not make the headlines. They did not win medals or change the course of the war, but they revealed something deeper, that even inside a conflict built on hatred and ideology, humanity could still find its way through the smoke. For the German soldiers who witnessed it, disbelief often gave way to silent respect. They could not comprehend why their enemy, The same men who had destroyed their positions hours earlier would now risk their own lives to save them. The war had turned men into enemies, but medicine reminded them they were still human. And that truth, fragile yet undeniable, was spreading across the cold, broken landscape of Europe. The snow kept falling. The front lines moved, then stalled. But somewhere beyond the thunder of guns, a faint understanding began to form, that compassion could exist even where mercy had died. The U.S. Army Medical Corps entered Europe with a mission that was more moral than military. Its men were trained not to hate, not to fight, but to heal. Every medic memorized a creed: to save life, to ease suffering, to carry hope where there was none. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They carried no rifles, only bandages, plasma, and reports from the front told of strange fleeting truces, brief silences where medics from both sides moved through shell holes to collect the injured. There were no official negotiations, no flags waved, just a shared understanding that suffering belonged to no nation. Afterward, when the firing resumed, both sides returned to killing each other, but those few minutes of peace lingered like ghosts. They became part of the hidden memory of the war, moments of humanity that the world rarely saw. In some cases, American medics even treated enemy prisoners inside their own aid stations, side by side with U.S. soldiers. The same hands that had fought hours earlier were now being stitched, bandaged, and fed. The ethical line between us and them blurred in those rooms filled with the smell of iodine and blood. Doctors worked until exhaustion, knowing that saving an enemy life was not treason. It was proof that the war had not yet stripped mankind of its soul. But this mercy came at a price. Many medics were killed while attempting to rescue wounded Germans. Some were shot by snipers who mistook their movements for tactical advances. Others died trying to retrieve men lying too close to enemy lines. Their bravery was rarely recorded, their names often lost in the mud. Yet the survivors carried those moments forever. For them, the memory of a German soldier whispering "Danke" through bloodied lips was worth more than any decoration. The war in Europe was entering its darkest, coldest months. The Ardennes offensive would soon erupt, turning Belgium into a frozen inferno. Medics would be tested like never before, racing between collapsing lines and burning forests to pull men, friend and foe alike, from the jaws of death. Their actions would defy logic, defy orders, and even defy survival itself. But in doing so, they would create stories that neither side could forget. Yet many who fell into American hands found something entirely different. Accounts from captured Germans tell of medics wrapping them in blankets, feeding them water, and whispering reassurance in broken English. One recalled being carried through the snow by 2 American medics, who refused to leave him despite sniper fire snapping above them. He remembered asking, "Why help me?" And the medic only replied, "You'd do the same." Of course, the German knew he might not have. That answer haunted him for years. From the German trenches, those acts seemed almost impossible. To watch enemy medics run into open ground, under relentless artillery, just to reach wounded men wearing field gray uniforms. It was something that broke the rhythm of hatred. Some German officers ordered their men to hold fire when medics appeared, even if it meant letting Americans retrieve the injured. Others couldn't bring themselves to shoot, not out of mercy, but confusion. The war had taught them to dehumanize, but what they saw before them was the opposite of the machine they served. It was raw humanity in motion. Yet on the battlefield, confusion was everywhere. Medics had to navigate the chaos of combat where there were no safe zones. Smoke obscured everything, uniforms were caked in mud, and cries for help echoed from every direction. They crawled between shell craters, dragging stretchers, unsure whether the next sound would be a plea or a trap. There were stories of wounded soldiers, American and German alike, used as bait by desperate units. Each rescue was a gamble, but medics kept moving forward. They followed instinct and training, not politics. The battlefield itself was a living nightmare. The air smelled of cordite and decay. Trees were splintered by shells. The snow turned red by blood. Medics often worked without backup, crawling for hours through debris to reach just one survey. As winter deepened, the forest battles grew more desperate. Medics were stretched thin, supplies dwindled, and exhaustion set in. Yet, the reports of compassion multiplied. It was as if, the worse the war became, the more determined these men were to prove that something good could survive it. In every direction, hatred was taught, shouted, and burned into the minds of men. But out there, in the white silence between the guns, compassion was still being practiced, not as an idea, but as a physical act. And each time a medic stepped into that silence, the world became, if only for a second, a little less cruel. The courage of medics was not born from rank or command, but from conviction. Their leaders could not order compassion. It had to come from within. Still, the chain of command played a quiet but vital role in protecting that fragile space where humanity could survive. Officers knew that medics were the soul of the unit. A platoon that saw its medics crawl through gunfire to save others often found new strength to fight on. The presence of a medic, crouched with his aid bag in steady hands, reminded every soldier that his life mattered, that he was not just another expendable body in the machine of war. Leadership often faced a difficult balance. Saving enemy wounded could mean exposing men to greater danger, slowing the advance, or draining precious medical supplies. Commanders had to decide when mercy became too costly, but many allowed their medics to act freely, even when it meant risking more lives. Some officers quietly admired the medics' defiance of pure military logic. They saw it as a higher kind of bravery, one that reflected the ideals America claimed to fight for. To save the enemy, in the midst of total destruction, was to prove that moral victory could still exist within military victory. The tools of that mercy were simple, yet remarkable for they had to meet it, over and over, and still find the strength to resist it. Some broke down, others grew silent and distant, but a few found purpose in that suffering. To them, every man saved, even one, meant the world had not yet lost its soul. Among the Germans, there were similar figures. Sanitäter, who carried their own red crosses, often with the same devotion. On rare occasions, American and German medics found themselves working side by side, sharing morphine or bandages when supplies ran out. Language didn't matter. Their shared profession was its own language, a silent brotherhood born of necessity. After battles, when corpses were collected, medics from both sides sometimes exchanged brief nods before parting again into the war. These gestures were small, but they stood against the entire weight of hatred that had built this conflict. The moral angle was perhaps the most profound. War demanded that soldiers see the enemy as less than human. It was how killing became possible. But medics were trained to see only the human body, fragile and sacred. Their work quietly contradicted the propaganda on both sides. In every act of healing, they declared that life had value, even in a world determined to destroy it. This moral defiance did not change strategies or redraw borders, but it changed people. A German soldier saved by an American medic could never again fully believe in the image of the merciless invader. An American who treated a dying German might come to see the futility of hate. These experiences planted seeds that would grow long after the war ended. There was also a kind of paradox in their bravery. Medics fought against death without being allowed to fight back. They could not carry rifles or defend themselves beyond a pistol rarely used. Yet their courage was unmistakable. Soldiers would say, "If the medic goes, we all go." When a medic fell, the entire unit felt the loss more deeply than almost any other. It was as if the moral heartbeat of the company had stopped. In the darkest moments, that heartbeat, the willingness to care, to save, to risk everything, was what kept the line from collapsing. For the German soldiers who saw Americans do this for their own wounded, disbelief eventually gave way to something more powerful: gratitude. After the battles, captured German letters described their shock at being treated like humans. Some even wrote that it made them ashamed of what they had believed. That quiet transformation, from hate to humility, was one of the war's rare miracles. It did not stop the fighting, but it revealed that compassion could outlive ideology. And it was this fragile truth, this quiet courage born in the mud and blood of Europe, that would soon be tested to its breaking point in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, where mercy itself would walk into the heart of hell. The Ardennes, December 1944. The snow was so thick it swallowed sound, and the forests seemed endless. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, Hitler's final gamble to split the Allied lines and seize the port of Antwerp. The American front, stretched thin and unprepared, was struck with fury. Entire divisions were swallowed by the surprise assault. Villages burned, tanks froze in the drifts, and thousands were cut off. In the middle of that frozen hell, the medics went to work. They had no time to think, only to act. Shells fell without warning. Men screamed for help, their voices echoing off the trees. Snow turned crimson. In one shattered clearing near the village of Bulge, American medics scrambled through the wreckage of a destroyed convoy. Dozens of soldiers, both American and German, lay dying together in the cold. Bullets snapped overhead as the medics moved between them. There was no order, no safe direction. Only the wounded mattered. Private William "Red" Anderson was 22 years old, a field medic with the 16th Infantry Regiment. When the German artillery began to fall, he dropped to his knees beside a wounded man, only to realize the man's helmet bore an eagle and swastika. The German was gasping, clutching his chest. Anderson hesitated for just a moment, then tore open his aid kit. He bandaged the wound, injected morphine, and dragged the soldier into the cover of a ditch. Around him, explosions chewed the earth. Anderson didn't see uniforms anymore, just faces. When he reached the next man, it was an American. He treated him the same way. Nearby, 2 other medics crawled toward a cluster of wounded lying between the lines. Machine guns raked the ground around them. They shouted, "Medic, nicht schießen!" Don't shoot. It was a desperate plea, but somehow the firing paused. German troops, watching through the trees, held their fire as the medics reached the wounded. For a few minutes, the war froze along with the air. When the medics returned, dragging stretchers through the snow, something strange happened. German soldiers stood up from their foxholes and waved, not as a signal of surrender, but of respect. One raised his hand to his helmet in salute. The medics didn't answer. They just kept moving, covered in blood that belonged to both sides. Farther north, near Bastogne, the 101st Airborne was surrounded and on our siege. Food was scarce, ammunition low, and temperatures brutal. In makeshift aid stations dug into cellars and barns, American medics worked by lantern light. The air reeked of smoke, antiseptic, and frost. Wounded Germans were carried in alongside Americans, frostbitten, bleeding, silent with shame. The medics treated them anyway, stitching, splinting, and comforting without a word. One German soldier, too weak to speak English, pressed a hand against his rescuer's arm and whispered, "Warum? Why?" The medic, exhausted, only said, "Because you're hurt." Outside, the battle raged without mercy. German shells smashed the town, and the wounded kept coming. Every few hours, medics risked the open fields to retrieve more casualties, pulling sleds through snow that reached their knees. They didn't care which army the men had belonged to. Inside those walls, uniforms no longer mattered. Humanity had reclaimed a small piece of ground, perhaps the only piece that still meant something. There were times when this mercy seemed almost suicidal. In one recorded incident near Elsenborn Ridge, a group of medics went to rescue 2 wounded men lying in the open. German snipers watched them crawl through the white expanse. Everyone expected the shots to come, but none did. Later, captured German soldiers said their officers had ordered the marksmen to hold fire. They were unarmed, one prisoner explained. They were brave. We couldn't shoot, Moments like these were never planned, never ordered. They emerged from instinct, human instinct, overpowering the machinery of war. It was as if, amid the roar of artillery and the endless cruelty of the battlefield, something deep within both sides refused to die. But mercy came at a cost. Many medics never made it back. Some were cut down by artillery while tending to the wounded. Others froze to death before they could reach safety. Their sacrifice was rarely recorded in reports or headlines. Yet, for those who witnessed it, soldiers from both sides, it became an image they could never forget. In the forests of the Ardennes, where hatred was supposed to rule, compassion had walked into the heart of chaos, unarmed, fearless, and unstoppable. And what came next would test that compassion beyond imagination. As the battle reached its bloodiest breaking point, the Ardennes had become a nightmare of snow, smoke, and silence. After days of fighting, the front lines dissolved into a blur of chaos. Medics were everywhere and nowhere, ghosts moving between the living and the dead. Their stretchers cut narrow paths through forests so shattered that even the trees seemed to bleed. For many, there was no clear sense of time, only the rhythm of rescue, the endless return to danger. In the small Belgian village of Foy, near Bastogne, one such rhythm became legend. A team of American medics had established a makeshift aid post inside a half-collapsed chapel. The stained glass had been blown out, snow drifted across the floor, and candles flickered beside the wounded. Inside lay men from both armies, Americans with shredded uniforms and frostbitten hands, Germans with field-gray coats soaked in blood. Outside, the thunder of artillery shook the walls like a heartbeat. The medics worked without rest, their hands cracked and shaking from cold. One of them, Sergeant Thomas Howell. Medics still went out under fire to rescue both American and German wounded, left from earlier engagements. "If we stop helping them," one medic said, "we become them." In the days that followed, the siege of Bastogne tightened. Supplies ran dry. The wounded lay stacked in corners, their groans echoing through the basements. There was no anesthesia left, only whiskey and willpower. German shells fell constantly, sending clouds of plaster and dust into the air. Medics worked by touch when the lamps failed, pressing bandages into wounds they couldn't even see. And when new German prisoners were brought in, some medics shared what little morphine they had left with them. They didn't ask for thanks. The act itself was enough. Among the Germans, this behavior spread in whispers. Captured soldiers told others in their units, "The Americans treat our wounded like their own." Some refused to believe it until they saw it themselves. During a counterattack near Champs, a wounded German sergeant dragged himself toward American lines, terrified of execution. Instead, he was lifted onto a stretcher by two medics who didn't say a word. He later told interrogators that the experience changed him completely, that he had seen true courage not in those who killed, but in those who healed. By Christmas Eve, Bastogne was a frozen graveyard. Yet amid the ruins, small miracles persisted. In one aid station, an American doctor performed surgery on both Allied and German soldiers by the light of a single candle. When the shells fell close, everyone, friend and enemy, prayed together. There was no language barrier in pain. When the weather finally cleared and Allied planes began dropping supplies, many medics wept in relief. They had survived the impossible, carrying humanity through a landscape that seemed determined to erase it. But what stayed with them most wasn't the relief of victory. When the Battle of the Bulge finally ended in late January 1945, the snow began to thaw over a landscape that had witnessed both savagery and compassion in equal measure. The official reports listed more than 80,000 American casualties and nearly 100,000 German losses, men frozen where they fell, villages turned to ash, forests stripped bare. But for those who had been there, numbers meant little. What they remembered were the faces, the pale, trembling faces of men they had saved, and sometimes those they couldn't. As medics returned from the Ardennes, their uniforms were torn, their boots cracked from the cold, their hands marked by frostbite. Yet, for all the horror they had seen, there was something unspoken in their silence, a deep pride that they had carried humanity through hell. Many of them didn't even know how many lives they had saved. They only knew that they had refused to stop caring, no matter which uniform lay before them. American field hospitals were soon filled with both Allied and Axis wounded. The Geneva Convention had been tested under fire, and the medics had proven its worth. Prisoners of war who were treated by American doctors often expressed disbelief, not because of the care itself, but because it defied everything Nazi propaganda had taught them. They had been told the Americans were brutal, uncivilized. Instead, they found men who risked their own safety to save them. One German corporal later recalled in an interview, "I was hit near St. Vith. I thought they would leave me there, but an American medic dragged me back through the snow. I remember his breath freezing in the air. He looked at me and said nothing. He just worked. I never forgot that face." Acts like these began to ripple through the prisoner camps. Letters written by captured German soldiers to their families, some intercepted by censors, spoke of the strange kindness. Commanders alike recognized that the medics had upheld something rare, a kind of moral victory that outlasted the war itself. Still, for every life saved, there were countless others lost. When the snow finally melted, the fields revealed bodies buried under ice and rubble. Medics were among the first to return to recover the fallen, both American and German. They carried the dead with the same quiet care they had shown the living. For them, there was no enemy anymore, only men who had suffered in the same storm. And though the war in Europe still raged on toward Germany's borders, the Battle of the Bulge left behind a question that lingered in every survivor's mind. How, amid such destruction, had compassion endured? The answer, perhaps, lay not in orders or faith, but in something simpler: the refusal to let hatred win completely. In the months following the Battle of the Bulge, as Allied forces pushed across the Rhine and into Germany, the legacy of the medics' courage followed quietly behind the advancing armies. Field hospitals sprang up in ruined towns and farmhouses, their makeshift wards crowded with men from both sides of the front. By then, the medics had long stopped seeing uniforms. They saw only wounds. The front was shifting rapidly, but the memories of the Ardennes remained raw. Every stretcher carried through the mud reminded them of that frozen forest, where they had crawled beneath shells to reach the dying. The war was entering its final and most desperate phase, yet the same code of mercy guided them still. When they crossed into German villages for the first time, many were shocked to find civilians starving and terrified. Children hid from them, expecting violence. Instead, the same medics who had rescued German soldiers now handed out their rations to the villagers. Compassion had survived the winter and was spreading into enemy soil. For Maas, Wehrmacht prisoners, the treatment they received in American medical tents marked the first crack in their belief in the Nazi cause. Some spoke later of how it shattered their understanding of the enemy. "They could have let me die," one soldier told an interviewer in 1946. "Instead, they gave me blood, food, and a blanket. I began to wonder if everything I had been told was a lie." American commanders noticed it too. Intelligence officers reported that German troops, once fearful of capture, began surrendering more willingly after hearing how prisoners were being treated. Stories of American medics risking their lives for wounded Germans had circulated even in Wehrmacht trenches. What had begun as individual acts of humanity had, in an unexpected way, influenced the morale and psychology of the battlefield itself. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities leveled, nations hollowed, families scattered. But among the ruins, medics were still at work. They treated survivors of concentration camps, tended to civilians who had lost everything, and helped rebuild shattered hospitals. Their mission hadn't ended with the ceasefire. If anything, its importance had only grown. For the men who had worn the Red Cross on their arms, peace brought no relief from memory. Many returned home carrying invisible scars. Some were haunted by the faces of the wounded they couldn't reach in time. Others struggled to explain to their families what it felt like to kneel beside a dying enemy and feel no hatred. But for all the pain, there was also quiet pride. The knowledge that, in the darkest hours of war, they had refused to surrender their humanity. Decades later, historians would look back on the Battle of the Bulge as a defining test of endurance and strategy. But in the margins of that vast military story, the accounts of medics offered a different perspective. One not of victory or defeat, but of moral resistance. Their deeds rarely made it into official reports, yet veterans who survived often said those acts of compassion were what gave the war its last fragments of meaning. In reunions held years after the fighting, American medics sometimes met the very German soldiers they had once treated. Gray-haired men shook hands over coffee, their eyes clouded with memory. Some brought photographs, others small gifts. A few said nothing at all, because nothing needed to be said. They had shared something beyond language, beyond nationality, a moment in which the war itself seemed to stop. The story of those medics became more than a chapter in military history. It became a testament, proof that even amid a war fought on a scale of destruction the world had never seen, the human heart could still choose compassion. It was not strategy that saved those men in the snow. It was empathy. And for the Wehrmacht soldiers who had once stared in disbelief as American medics saved their lives, that memory would outlast the Reich, the ideology, and the hatred that had brought them to that battlefield. It would remain as one of the war's rarest victories. The triumph of mercy over vengeance. When the guns finally fell silent, Europe was a graveyard of nations. Cities were reduced to ash, and millions had vanished into the smoke of history. Yet amid that silence, something fragile and indestructible endured. The simple, stubborn act of one human being helping another. The story of the American medics in the Ardennes was not written in medals or orders. It was written in blood-soaked bandages, trembling hands, and the quiet exchange of a single look between enemies who, for a moment, stopped being enemies at all. War often reveals the worst of mankind, but in rare moments, it also reveals the best. The medics who crawled through snow and shellfire to save German wounded had no certainty of survival. They didn't act for glory or recognition. They acted because compassion, even in war, was not negotiable. It was what made them human in a place designed to destroy humanity. Their courage redefined the meaning of victory. It wasn't the conquest of cities or the defeat of armies that would endure, but the proof that mercy could exist in the most merciless of places. Decades later, survivors still remembered not the faces of their captors or commanders, but of the men who carried them through the snow, their enemies who became, for a brief and unforgettable moment, their saviors. The Battle of the Bulge remains one of the bloodiest struggles of the Second World War. But behind the thunder of artillery and the strategy of generals, its true legacy lies in the quiet, unseen bravery of those who healed instead of killed. Their story reminds us that war does not erase humanity, it tests it. And in that frozen winter of 1944, among the shattered trees and dying fires, humanity passed that test. Because even when the world was at its darkest, compassion still found a way to shine.